Hello, good afternoon. My name is Michele Mitchell, and this is Where Are We? From Voter Suppression to Insurrection, Reflections on the 2020 Election. And this particular webinar we've been kicking around in the Diversity Committee in the History Department, various ideas about an election-related webinar. And we knew that it was going to be a historic election, and we already knew that a topic was going to be sort of growing authoritarian tendencies in the United States. But then January 6th happened. And so we are going to foreground things talking about voter suppression, but we are going to go up to very, very recent events. And I want to say that before we start off, voter suppression has a long history in this country. Both major parties have participated in it. States have done it through their constitutions. In the South, there was a white primary that excluded voters of color. In the more present era, ID laws have tended to exclude young people and Native Americans. Signature matches can discriminate against naturalized Asian immigrants. Removal of polling places has impacted Latinx and Black voters, as has the elimination of mailboxes and drop-off boxes in states like Texas, where there was recently one mailbox per county, and you had people having to drive 100 miles or so just to vote. So the key thing is that even though we are going to be thinking about voter suppression more in the present, that has tended to be connected to the Republican Party, it does go back to both major parties. And so I'm going to play a quick clip of a man who was interviewed in Mississippi in the 1990s, and he's talking about his grandfather who was alive, who was born in the 1870s.
Black folks at one time in this county had all the offices, sheriff, everything. And they stole the offices back during Reconstruction. They stole the offices from them. Guess how they stole the offices? The day before the election, they had all these big rallies for them, and they put croton oil in the food. Croton oil is something like castor oil, and it makes you go to the bathroom. And the next day, when the black folks supposed to be going to vote, they couldn't go because all of them had diarrhea. They couldn't go to the poll. It's documented. White folks documented it. I couldn't believe that shit. I read that and I asked Papa about it. He said, yeah, that was a fact.
Did he? Well, I'm sure
yeah.
He remember it. But
no, but Papa was old enough to remember it. He was a little boy when they did it. Yeah. Yeah, because Papa was born in like 1870 something. Right after the Civil War. Put croton oil in the food, and they give all these big parties and rallies just like they do now.
Right.
Like this week, they've been having all the big fish fries and stuff for black folks now. They put croton oil in the damn food, and you spend the next day in the bathroom.
It is now my pleasure and honor to introduce the panelists for today's session, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. So they'll both speak, and then we'll open the session up for questions. Stephen Hahn is professor of history at New York University. He is a specialist on the international history of slavery, as well as on emancipation, race, the construction of the American Empire, and on the social and political history of the long 19th century. In the United States, Hahn has written for The Nation, Dissent, The New Republic, Le Monde Diplomatique, and The New York Times. A Pulitzer Prize winner, Hahn is the author of 4 books, including A Nation Without Borders, The United States and Its World in an Age of Civil Wars, 1830 to 1910. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is a historian, educator, and commentator on fascism, authoritarian leaders, and propaganda, and the threats these present to democracies around the world. Professor of History and Italian Studies at New York University, she is the author or editor of 7 books and many essays and op-eds in media outlets, including CNN, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and The Washington Post. Her newest book is Strongmen, From Mussolini to the Present. A bestseller, Strongmen is the first book to place Donald Trump in the perspective of a century of illiberal rule. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Hahn. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for all your work, and Maura and Karen for putting this together. I know it's challenging. Where are we? I wish I could respond with some level of confidence to that question, except to say that I think we're in a dangerous place. I suspect that much of what I'm going to say you've already been thinking about or know, but I did feel like I could offer up some ideas that might be a good basis for discussion, and I'm sure Ruth's presentation will be of special help. Needless to say, the election and politics of 2020 present us with what I would say is an onslaught of contradictions. On the one side, there were really remarkable developments. Incumbent president was defeated for re-election. This has only happened 5 times since 1900. It was much more common in the 19th century. And he was beaten by a Democrat who was running on the most progressive platform the Democratic Party has ever put forward. We know that turnout in the election was exceptionally high, about 67% of all eligible voters. Maura, could you put up the turnout document? And in more than half of the states, it was higher than that, the high of 80% in Minnesota, but also this suggests that there was a lot of variation. As it turns out, in many, many cities, the turnout rate was lower than the national average, and the difference between 2016 and 2020 was not all that great. This is true in Philadelphia. You can see it's also true in Milwaukee. The other counties are either suburban counties or rural exurbs. You can see, say, in the case of Waukesha and Wisconsin, that the turnout moved from 76% to 85.5%, and Trump won that county very handily. So the turnout worked in a number of different directions. But also, despite a great many lawsuits and misinformation, Trump's attempt to overturn the election was defeated. And quite remarkably, Georgia went for the Democrats in the general election for the first time since 1992, and went for both Democrats in the runoff, which is not supposed to happen in Georgia with a runoff election. Also, as we know, over the year, mass protests against police violence and systemic racism have captured enormous public attention and have really changed the conversation about the depth and extent of racism in this country, as well as about how our history ought to be viewed. I point in particular to the recognition that the Confederacy actually represented not only the defense of slavery and white supremacy, but itself was an act of treason. And this was represented and thought about in many high places. So I was quite surprised by that. For a time in the spring and early summer, public support for Black Lives Matter soared to 67%, including 60% of whites who were polled and 92% of Democrats. And even when that level slipped over the summer months and into the early fall, still as late as September and October, a majority of adults in the United States viewed Black Lives Matter favorably. Not entirely clear how all of this worked into the election, but it may well have helped Biden in some of the suburban districts. And yet, the election had a great many disturbing features, especially given the disaster that COVID inflicted on the country and that the Trump administration handled so poorly. We know that more than 74 million people cast ballots for Donald Trump. He won a higher proportion of the popular vote in 2020 than he did in 2016. Maura, if you could put up the election demographics slide, that would be helpful. More than 60% of white men and about 55% of white women voted for Trump. I might add, these are similar percentages of white voters who supported David Duke in Louisiana in the 1990s. And Trump did better among Black men and Latinx voters generally, but Latino men in particular, than he did 4 years earlier in all sorts of ways. Trump did really well. I mean, in states like Ohio, Iowa, and Florida that Obama won in 2012, Trump increased his margins between 2016 and 2020 in places like Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, Trump lost by less than 1%, in Pennsylvania by less than 2%, and almost all of the counties that swung to Trump in 2016 remained in his column in 2020, some by larger margins. And we know that he made gains among Latinx and immigrant voters, whether in South Texas, which was very bad for Democrats in that state, or in the South Bronx. There is, of course, a lot of talk about the suburbs going blue, but as the figures suggest, Trump won 48% of the suburban vote. And if you can look at a place like Waukesha in Wisconsin, in some places he did extremely well. Closer to home in New York, Nassau County was won by Biden, but by a very close margin, and Trump won very handily in Suffolk County and bringing a lot of down ballot candidates along with him. By some measures, working class voters, including African Americans and Latinx, continued to move toward Trump. 93% of white working class counties, 88% of Black working class counties, and 64% of Latinx working class counties, 91% of working class counties in aggregate saw increases in the tallies for Trump between 2016 and 2020. Now, admittedly, the metrics here, a working class county tends to be defined as one with a more than a majority of non-college educated voters. I think this is a problematic metric, but at least it offers some view. Now, even more sobering, as we know, were the results down ballot. The Democrats had great hopes of increasing their margins in the House of Representatives. They almost lost control. They had hopes of winning a real majority in the Senate. They only managed to get 50 because of the runoff election. Basically, on the state level, the legislatures did not change hands except in one case in both directions. And the only governorship that changed went in the direction of the Republicans in Montana, where Greg Gianforte won by a whopping 13 points. And I might add, if the name sounds familiar, he was the one who was running for a congressional seat in Montana, who was pled guilty to body slamming a journalist. The state results, of course, are problematic given the fact that when the 2020 census is available, it will set the stage for redistricting, all of which I think is to say that, you know, the elections of 2016 and 2020 were frighteningly similar, it seems to me, even if the presidential outcomes were different. Now, there is, of course, lots of talk and speculation about civil warfare in the Republican Party and whether Trump will retain his influence or leadership. And my sense is that there's a lot of wishful thinking that goes into this. I mean, Trump support, hardcore supporters make up about 1/3 of the American electorate and well over half of the Republican Party. They're white nationalists who have been in that camp for some time, well before Trump came on the scene, some of whom were Tea Partiers, many of whom were Gingrich-type Republicans who believe that they faced an existential crisis and are prepared to fight by any means available. They've also figured out, and this goes back to the voter suppression issue, how to win elections, which is not only to legislate the suppression of votes through voter ID laws or changing polling places or times of voting, but also through charges of fraud, corruption, and theft, needless to say, which always point to cities where there are large populations of color. When Scott Perry in Pennsylvania made the charge about how the state's election outcome should be challenged, he wasn't talking about his own district in the center of the state. He was talking about Philadelphia. And so my concern going forward is that, you know, the Republican Party will double down on their voter restriction efforts, both for in-person and mail-in ballots, along with likely deploying greater intimidation at polling sites in an effort to prevent fraud. My concern, too, is that we won't see an election in which the results are widely accepted as legitimate for quite some time. Now, as we all know, Republicans have other advantages, too. There's the Electoral College, there's the distribution of Senate membership, And of course, there's state legislatures which have swung very strongly in the Republican direction since 2008, something in the manner of antebellum slaveholders. The Republicans wield disproportionate power owing to the Constitution and the wider system of governance. Whatever one might say or hope, there doesn't seem to be room for anyone in the Republican Party who isn't on board. The growth of paramilitaries and the many Republicans who defend, excuse, faintly criticize, or fully embrace them shows that they mean business and they have become increasingly interconnected. We know that the white power and militia movements have their roots in Vietnam-era veterans who felt betrayed by their political and military leaders and scorned by a liberal public. This is a phenomenon, of course, that has many antecedents, including among fascist squads in Italy after World War I, that Ruth is more than well aware of, and the Reconstruction Klan in the United States, which was basically reconstituted Confederate units. These right-wing extremists, as we have seen, have developed networks that stretch across the country. There are many thousands of people who, if they're not involved, they are supporters or sympathizers in various ways and have elaborated theories of conspiracy and left-wing and government tyranny. And as is true in contemporary Germany and elsewhere, they have turned the military and law enforcement into recruiting grounds. And so we see in the recent attacks, not only on the United States Capitol, but also on state capitals. You know, this is quite clear in the profiles of the insurrectionists and in the utter failure of various policing units to secure the buildings and the lawmakers. What it all demonstrated is that the right has convinced, I really think this is the case, a very substantial portion of the voting public that customary electoral means may not be sufficient to the task of protecting white privilege and power, and that the shock troops in not insignificant numbers are armed and ready to go. Now, some of that feeling, of course, is attributable to Trump and his supporters, but I think it's important to recognize that it's by no means all about Trump. For many years, I'm sure Ruth will talk much more about this, studies have shown that a substantial portion of the American public inclines to authoritarianism. They wouldn't necessarily say this explicitly, but in a variety of surveys, it appears that anywhere from about 15% to perhaps as many as 40% value a strong leader who is not necessarily beholden to Congress or elections, value the maintenance of law and order over civil liberties, value authority, obedience, and uniformity rather than freedom, independence, and diversity, have few problems with limiting press freedoms or harassing opposition parties, and believe in many cases that their political opponents are threats to them and their way of life. They're obviously fearful of other racial, religious, and ethnic groups, and may agree, and I quote, sometimes other groups must be kept in their place. Not surprisingly, they lean heavily Republican. Now, these authoritarian dispositions that are accentuated by religious fundamentalism will be here well after Trump departs, whenever that is, all the more so in view of the confluence of crises that currently afflict us. Let me just finish by pointing to, I think, a fundamental problem that plagues the Democratic Party going forward, and I think will set limits to its pursuit of a more progressive agenda. And that is a new version of the divide that afflicted the party between the 1930s and the 1960s. Now, you know, that then it was a divide between an ostensibly liberal North and a conservative white supremacist South. Now it's a divide between well-to-do professionals and some sectors of the finance on the one side, and working class people of color, mostly African American and Latinx, with some white working class support on the other. The divide was in evidence in the recent election cycle in California, when Californians gave Biden an overwhelming victory, but voted down a ballot measure to raise commercial property taxes. And there was a similar story in Illinois, where a proposed tax increase on incomes over $250,000, which was meant simply to avoid draconian budget cuts, failed in general, and often in the suburbs where Biden rolled up huge margins. Pursuing racial justice and addressing deep social inequalities will require structural changes that shift wealth and power away from the well-to-do and toward communities of color and working people more generally. Frankly, it's never happened before, at least in a sustained way, and I can't see it happening anytime soon, so long as our system, current system of governance is maintained. You know, one could say that we're looking at a generational transition in which a declining older demographic, declining demographic of older white voters is mounting something of a last stand, and that a growing demographic, say, of Latinx voters seems poised to turn numbers of red states purple or blue. But let's not forget that white and European minorities, even tiny ones, have succeeded quite nicely in riding herd over majorities of color in the South, in much of the Caribbean basin, in Latin America, and in South Africa, not to mention in very large areas long subject to Euro-American colonialism. And although it's certainly possible to imagine a progressive coalition emerging with young white voters who are not smitten by capitalism joining African-American and Latinx voters, perhaps some others, I fear it's more likely, frighteningly, as crises associated with climate change and global resource allocation intensify, that young white voters who thus far have been largely resistant to the right, and Trump failed to kind of develop a youth following, could be drawn to authoritarian solutions that promise them safety and security, perhaps with the assistance of paramilitary types who will remain very active for a long time and whose apocalyptic visions may seem more credible even to those who now regard them with scorn. And I'll finish there. Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this, Michele, and thank you, Mara, and everyone else. So Trump didn't wreck democracy. He didn't have time. It wasn't a question of will. It was a question of time in part and our success at mobilizing. But Trump never intended to govern in any democratic with a small d sense of the word. His goals and priorities never had anything to do with public welfare or bipartisan governance. He was in power for reasons that map on to authoritarian governance. One of his main goals was to turn public office into a money-making machine for Trump Organization. And so when people say he's lazy or incompetent because he's always golfing, the golfing is making money and promoting the Trump brand. And he had a very sweet deal going on where, you know, he could use Secret Service and all of this inflow into Trump property off of public office. He also wanted to build his personality cult to keep people loyal to him and domesticate the party. And I would say he's had astonishing success, considering he didn't create the grand old party, far from it. Because sometimes leaders who have such great success in wrapping the party around their finger had created their parties. We can go all the way back to Mussolini or Berlusconi, who created Forza Italia. So Trump's been extremely successful in having this party discipline, as it's called, in authoritarian contexts. And of course, he needed to spread hatred because leaders like Trump depend on the pernicious effects of polarization. So we can't understand his actions, nor those of his followers and his GOP enablers up through January 6th without reference to authoritarianism and its history. Now, today, we don't have as many military coups. There was just one in Myanmar, but today, authoritarians come to power through elections, and they have to manipulate elections to stay there. And as Professor Mitchell and Professor Hahn said, this is particularly easy in the States, given the history of racialized voter suppression. And by the way, Michele, the audio clip that you played about the Croton oil against the enemies, you know, the fascists, early fascism, the squadrists used castor oil, and they used it to publicly humiliate the enemies, but also to keep people at home so they couldn't vote. So I just want to mention that. So Trump, you know, energized and legitimized existing, and this was a point already made, anti-democratic, racist, and extremist tendencies and movements in America. And the race war he waged only highlighted how fragile and recent our democracy is, which again is, I date to the 1960s, you know, voting rights for all. So all of this matters when we consider the traumatic post-history of the November election. And that's what I'm going to focus on. And it was obvious that Trump was not going to leave office quietly. And I had to turn in my book, Strongmen, in the summer. And the last thing I wrote is that, you know, you can't underestimate what he's going to do. He's not going to want to leave. And indeed, the Authoritarian Playbook doesn't have a chapter on failure. It doesn't have any pages on the horror of being voted out of office, which actually happened to Augusto Pinochet in Chile, or forced into exile. And part of this is, we don't have time to go into why all this is, but authoritarians regard the loss of adulation and power and immunity from prosecution, very important, as an existential threat. And so they're very unprepared to leave office because they're also believing their propaganda. So they tend to engage in desperate measures if they think their power is threatened or indeed they are voted out. Some start wars, some plan coups, and political scientists have a name for this phenomenon called gambling for resurrection, something desperate that you think will somehow allow you to stay in power. So, of course, this is a frame for seeing what Trump did. And the methods he pursued to try and overturn the election during this endlessly long period, which I personally believe we need to revisit this business of allowing so many months in between, because democracy is an honor system. When you have somebody he's a criminal, because many authoritarians were already criminals when they came into office or under investigation, these things don't work, as we've seen very clearly. And we should pay close attention to what he did, all the different things he did, because they could be normalized in the future. So the GOP is now a far-right party, and there have been many comparative politics studies that have come out since 2016 that they look at the GOP in a global framework, its rhetoric and its platforms, and it doesn't line up anymore with conservative parties. It lines up with far-right parties. From Erdogan's party in Turkey to Golden Dawn, an extremist party in Greece, to elements in common with Modi's party in India. So we need to think about that. This is a huge problem, and it comes from the Tea Party, as Professor Hahn said. But now it has been souped up and it's made acceptable. So this party no longer has any interest in democratic methods of bipartisan governance. So most of the people don't. So all of this is important in interpreting why he had such support as he did these things. So first, he evoked the age of military coups because he explored a military intervention with the regular armed forces. And this is why General Michele, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, came up, quote, out of the blue to make a declaration that the armed forces was not going to obey an individual, but only the Constitution. And there were other declarations and petitions by former defense secretaries. And all of this tells you that there were machinations going on. And then the whole electoral manipulation attempts that Trump engaged in, they have a history in America, of course, but they also are how authoritarianism already operates in the 21st century. Under Putin and under Orban and under Erdogan. And these are all leaders Trump admires and had a lot of contact with. Election results that don't go your way become just another piece of information to be denied and replaced with a fabrication that creates the false reality you need to stay in office. So it's not just voter suppression. It's when things don't go your way, you find them, you try and invalidate them, you challenge them, you litigate them, you try and find technicalities. And this is called lawfare as it's practiced in Putin's Russia and other places. So there was that. And finally, he channeled really early fascism in a way, and calling on his most loyal supporters, who include, as is becoming more and more clear, many people in government, in the military, in law enforcement, to stop the steal and rescue him from defeat. And this reminds me of the black shirts and the brown shirts who used violence to defend their leaders. And one insurgent, you may have seen the image of one of the people inside the Capitol who had a Camp Auschwitz shirt, just to make the link clear. And so it's worth having a moment to talk about followers. What happens to followers when they feel their leader is endangered or is being unjustly treated? So they become extremely volatile. It's a very turbulent period for them. I say this with zero sympathy for them, but that this is part of the psychology. It's very important to focus on the followers as well as the leader. And here, Trump's highly effective propaganda depicting him as a victim matters a lot, because when we think about personality cults, and these are all, in some ways, terms that Americans or frames of reference Americans are not familiar with. When you say personality cult, you think of like Mao and huge pictures of Gaddafi or, North Korean leaders. But Trump, as we recede more and go more in time, and his presidency recedes, we will see him as a highly skilled propagandist who had an authentic personality cult. All the more remarkable because he didn't have a closed society. We kept an opposition party, we kept a press, and he still was able to make these bonds. So being the victim is highly important to maintain this bond and get people to engage in violence, to come to see that violence is the only way that political change can happen, and to defend you if necessary. So January 6th was a rescue operation of this leader who was beleaguered. And as Professor Hahn said, Trump, the mechanism is that, there are existing authoritarian tendencies in the population. And what the leader does, and this happens over and over again, as I recount in my book, it's certain, if the conditions are right, social, economic conditions are right, he gives it a focus, and he gives it a legitimation. And once he's elected, it's a presidential legitimation. You cannot underestimate what it was for not only the neo-Nazis of Charlottesville, but all the people who may have been thinking about following them, that they were called very fine people by the President of the United States. Probably they didn't even expect that kind of elevation, kind of legitimation. So I was very struck that Trump told his followers at the rally that preceded the assault, and also in the video he tweeted hours after the assault began, he told them he loved them. He told them they were special. He told them that their journey together was just beginning. And so this is part of the incitement. When we think of incitement, we think it's only about hatred. And it is about hatred, right? They had murderous rage. But they feel loved by the leader, and he has to keep telling them this. And this is what spurs them. And indeed, the video footage and all the things we've seen, they're fighting for Trump. They were committing violence for him and him alone. Indeed, they were ready to kill Pence. They were ready to, they didn't seem that concerned to only be attacking Democrats. So this is why the anchoring of the leader is really important. Even though I agree with Professor Hahn's point, and I make that clear in my book, it's not, you can't say it's all about Trump. But in this particular circumstance, the leader-follower thing is quite important. And I'm going to share my screen and just show a couple of slides. Where is here it is. So let's see, that you saw. So the film that was shown at the rally, the last frame of the film that stayed in the air while they were dispersing was Trump's face, which is super creepy. So his face fills the whole screen. And I freaked out when I saw that because there's several fascist films I've written about, and they end with the face filling the screen. It's like you obliterate all other reality. So I don't know which of these we can, let's go, keep it there. And I also, in the last part, I want to comment on the video footage that was shown by the Democratic impeachment managers in the first days of when they were making their arguments. And there's a huge dramatic tension that comes from these contrasts. In particular, this 13-minute montage that was presented by Representative Raskin was really masterful. And there was this terrifying juxtaposition of the decorum of the chamber, the quietness, the silence of the chamber, which is the heart of the operation of the rule of law. When one, lawmaker said he's calling the House to order, and this was juxtaposed with the terrifying, chaotic sounds of the mob that had this untrammeled fury trying to break the whole system down. And when there's and I'm going to show you a few clips, but Senate, the Mitch McConnell, Trump's biggest enabler, one of the major people who made all of this complicity of the GOP possible, he's standing there in the quiet, in the hushed chamber with the heavy carpets and the calming classical palette of colors, saying, quote, "We're debating a step that has never been taken in American history." And the mob outside is breaking glass, is knocking down barriers and chanting and assaulting police officers. And so this quietness, and even Mitch McConnell, who I see as completely part of the problem, but in that moment, when I looked at that, it's like the terrifying truth of Trump's oneness with the mob and his scorn for the protocols and procedures of democracy became even more real. So let me just, I don't want this on there. I myself was extremely upset watching, I had to watch this video footage for a piece I'm writing for CNN. I found it very disturbing to watch. I'm going to show very short clips, 2 clips that aren't even, one's only 15 seconds, but if you want to look away for the next 2 minutes, or I'll tell you when I'm done, because it's upsetting, and even I, who am immersed in all this horrible stuff all the time, I did find it hard to watch. I'm not going to show anybody getting assaulted, but I just wanted to tell you that. So sorry, let me just cue this up. Okay, so these are about the contrasts.
Are you going to share the screen? We can't see it right now.
Oh, why is that? Okay.
There we go.
Now? Okay.
Yes.
Hang on a second. I'm sorry, everyone. It's muted. Let me go back because I'm really only showing a tiny bit. Okay.
Madam Speaker, the Vice President, and the United States Senate. Off the subject.
Okay, awful. And then one more short one, just like 10 seconds of this. Okay.
Majority Leader.
We're debating a step that has never been taken in American history.
All right. So this it's just it's very well done. It to me provides convincing evidence of Trump's incitement. GOP senators are unlikely to vote to convict him, but of course the audience for this footage and the whole impeachment proceedings by the Democrats is the American people. And also, given that there's a concerted attempt by the GOP to minimize the violence or externalize it to a mob we have to keep remembering that quote mob includes Trump donors, Republican officials, policemen, military. So the threat is inside our institutions. So that the divide between the Pence and the McConnell, they may have suits on instead of Harley Davidson sweatshirts, but it's all very troubling. It's a lot to think about seeing these images. And of course, this was an inside job, and this will become much, much, much clearer. So finally, the images issue a clear warning. And if Trump's not convicted, he will feel hugely more empowered. And these kinds of personalities, the more you take away their limits, the more they become reckless. And so this increases the chances he will return to finish the job of wrecking our democracy. And the history of authoritarian takeovers bears this out. And January 6th, I always saw it as a trial run. And some failed coups beget successful coups. That happened in Chile in 1973. So one assaulter, and excuse my language, it's his language, he was frustrated the group wasn't entering the Capitol more rapidly. And he said, quote, what we fucking need to have is 30,000 guns up here. Someone answered him, the next trip. So that's next time. So what does this mean for the future, to conclude? We know how to mobilize, and it's really important to reiterate what Professor Hahn said, that in the history of authoritarian captures, we were undergoing a process of authoritarian capture, and we interrupted it. Against all odds, against voter suppression, pandemic threats, we voted this person out. So no, that is really important to hold on to. So we have a roadmap to mobilize, and what happened in Georgia also. But once he's unleashed for the White House, which he already is, he will be free, Trump, to act as a kind of extremist agitator, because that's his best. He and his crony Roger Stone, who he pardoned, all these people he pardoned. And the reason you pardon people, criminals, is to allow them to do more crimes on your behalf. And so he'll be able to work very freely to destabilize American democracy. And the playbook is to try and present Biden's administration as so incompetent and have things be so unstable with intermittent violence, perhaps, at state capitals, et cetera, that it increases the appetite for law and order governance. And so as part of a plan to return to the White House in 2024, whether it's Trump or somebody else. So on that happy note, I conclude.
Okay, I will pick up, and I just want to make a really quick point. I find it fascinating, Ruth, that there's actually the castor oil example from Italy. And the reason why I find that so fascinating is, as a historian of the United States, just on Wednesday in my undergraduate class, we were talking about violent voter suppression in the US South during Reconstruction. And so African Americans are testifying before the Senate and the House during trials meant to run the Klan underground. And they're talking about children being beaten, men being shot, ritualized rape of women. But then you go into the 20th century and you have things like Croton oil. And also, in addition to understanding clauses in which African Americans might be read part of the state constitution, and if they didn't interpret it to the registrar's understanding, they wouldn't be able to vote. You also had ridiculous tactics such as people being asked how many bubbles in a bar of soap. If there's a coffee can with dirt in it, how many grains of sand are in here? And so you have these things going on. And I think that you made a very important point about the GOP now being a far right party. And along those lines, and then I'm going to open it up to discussion, along those lines, one thing that's really critical is a whole range of political analysts have argued that the Republican Party is actually an increasingly minority party in an increasingly diverse nation and in a young nation. And there's also this demographic shift that demographers have been predicting for a long time, that by 2040, white people are going to be in a minority. And so when you think about the fact that, I'm going to read a quote by Eric Levitz in the New York Magazine and then open it up to questions. So if people have questions, please do put them in the Q&A, and then I'll address them to the panelists. Eric Levitz writes the following in the New York Magazine: the GOP is now a party that has no compunction about nullifying the voting rights of its opposition to retain power. And once a party has liberated itself from the shackles of respecting its detractors' rights, much else becomes permissible. So I fully agree with Professor Ben-Ghiat that what we just saw on the 6th might be a trial run, and the next attempt might very well be successful. Steve, did you want to weigh in before we open the floor up?
Why don't you open it up?
Okay, if there are any questions, please feel free to pose them in the Q&A. Okay, so there's a question. Could the panelists speak to the role of the internet and digital forms of media, which seem like a historical break from the longer history you've outlined? Thank you, Stefan. Steve, go ahead.
Well, you know, this obviously became more and more important beginning in the 1990s. And certainly, you know, one of the things that's interesting about the sort of white power and militia movements, you know, Oklahoma City, which we kind of forget about, was this moment that brought together the Michigan militia and white power and neo-Nazis and Klansmen. And, you know, immediately after that, it sort of seemed as though it was underground. And then it turned out that there was a new network that was being developed among them through the use of, you know, the internet, which was becoming more and more available and widely used. So there's no question that this is, you know, been, I mean, you know, you sort of wonder whether if we had an internet in the early 1970s, if Richard Nixon would have managed, you know, to avoid, you know, impeachment / resignation. So I think this is really important. I mean, I'm sure Ruth, you know, has more to say about that.
Yeah, if you look at the history of propaganda, there are many things that recur, such as personality cults, which the canons of personality cults are shockingly the same over 100 years. They have to be a man of the people, but they have to be above all other men and special, often ruling with divine benediction. But they have to use whatever the media is of the age to have a direct, unmediated channel with their people. And that's how they build the bond as well as rallies. And so social media just accelerates this. And it's a huge thing that Trump is permanently banned from Twitter. And I'm sure many of you saw that right after his ban went into effect, there was a notable, like, I think 30% drop in circulation of hate speech. Because it's a copycat effect, and especially when it's the head of state. And the same thing happens, you know, today, authoritarian leaders are extremely able at telling their stories and marketing themselves through social media. And Bolsonaro also uses his personal Twitter account to tell his story, including, you know, they have a lot of supposed disclosure when he goes into the hospital. He tweets from his hospital bed wearing a gown. So this unmediated contact is like this faux transparency, which is part of populism in a way. But the propaganda also works through repetition and saturation of society through different channels, so that ideally the same message with small variations is heard. You see it in many different places. And here, starting from the 2016 campaign, the Trump, because they come from a marketing background, they left the Clinton campaign in the dust. They took out something like 50 million separate ads with small variations on Facebook and other sites like that. The Clinton campaign only had 66,000 ads. And Andrew Marantz has a very good article in the New Yorker about this. And he interviewed Brad Parscale, who's now on the outs and disgraced a bit, but who said it was an e-commerce model. We could have been marketing sneakers, but we marketed Trump. So social media allows the acceleration, both from top down, from the leader, but also from followers, obviously. And these circuits become accelerated. And it's very difficult to rein them in if you are in our situation, 21st century, where you are dealing with non-government actors in the picture, like Facebook.
That's such a great answer. I'm glad that you brought up that 2016 example, because civil rights auditors have noted that Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter can all be used to spread misinformation, and they did so in 2016. Excellent. We've got another question, and this next question is, how can corporations be recruited or brought into the process of bringing politics back to the center? And I'll, whichever one of you want to field that one. How can corporations be recruited or brought into the process of bringing politics back to the center, or can they?
You mean from the right? I mean, I think the corporations at this point are probably interested in bringing politics to the center because they're most fearful of the kind of progressive impulses on the left and potentially the very disruptive ones on the right. You know, I think that's, but I mean, the role they want to play along those lines is not necessarily conducive to strengthening democracy. It's, I think they have always seen that kind of top-down politics, that more bureaucratic organization is the kind of thing that, you know, helps them out much more. I mean, they're happy to get on the side of token changes. They will, you know, there are a lot of companies now that donate money to Black Lives Matter. And certainly in terms of the kind of face to the public, they're interested in trying to appear more diverse, more inclusive, but it's not a, you know, their politics and their interest in addressing real questions of social inequality and social justice, I think, are pretty limited.
I would add that, but we've seen after January 6th that so consumers have way more power than they choose to exert. And there are organizations like Sleeping Giants and other ones that organize the equivalent of economic boycotts, or they out corporations or companies that are accepting advertising from far right or extremist sources. And that has been quite effective. And we saw after January 6th that many corporations, big ones even, decided to stop contributing to Ted Cruz or to Josh Hawley. Yeah. And we can do much more with this than we already do. It's a bit of discipline for the consumer, but we have this ability to because if they only care about profit, that can be used against them, and it is being used against them in many cases.
Great, thank you. Next question is, can the government restrict ideas or speech considered hurtful even before they are expressed?
What would that mean, even before they're expressed?
I don't know if it's just having like, guidelines in terms of public forums. I'm not necessarily certain what that means. If the person who asked it wants to add additional details, I would be happy to pass those along.
I have a poster in my book talking about cancel culture of Hitler in the 1920s, because Hitler took him 10 years to get to power. He was very frustrated, and so he was banned from public speaking in several German states. It was done at the state level, and so the Nazi Party issued these posters that kind of turned him into a martyr for free speech, like he was canceled. So I have a poster of him from German archives with his mouth taped shut and literally canceled. And it says, there's so many Germans, but only I am, silenced. So this, it didn't backfire. It actually contained hate speech. And the problem was that then Hitler convinced the state authorities that he was being mainstreamed. He was mainstreaming his image. He had Heinrich Hoffmann, photograph him looking like cleaned up, and Mussolini did the same thing in his time. And so the bans on his hate speech were lifted. And by the time the Depression hit, he had no ban anymore. And then we saw what happened. So
Indeed.
That's just an interesting, but I always like to talk about that because of ideas of cancel culture today.
And how it's being weaponized too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's where, clearly just as the right grabbed onto sort of colorblind law and, social deliberations, I think they're grabbing onto First Amendment, as Trump's lawyers are probably now presenting at the impeachment trial, to demonize the left and portray people on the left as threatening, just as they're threatening Second Amendment rights, they're going to be threatening First Amendment rights. So I think they've been very successful at doing this, and I think it helps account for the following that they have been able to amass and secure.
Well, along those lines, Steve, this question is, you both are free to address this question, but you spoke about this in your presentation. How to explain Trump's seemingly growing appeal to Latinx and Black voters?
That's obviously it's, among Latinx voters, it includes women as well as men, as far as the exit polling suggests. One way of doing it, it depends on where you're looking. It's certainly, there's some indication that the Trump campaign's attempt to portray the Democrats as socialists may have been useful. The extent of social conservatism among, some in the Latinx and community. If Irvin was here, I'd be really interested in hearing what he had to say about this. Certainly, even in 2016, Black men voted for Trump in greater numbers than, hardly any Black women voted for Trump. I think it could be part of his sort of macho representation, the way he deals with gender relations and his misogyny, a whole variety of things that I think could be important factors, because if you look at the mapping on this, it's pretty remarkable. Obviously he didn't win in a lot of these places, but if you sort of look at how votes trended, all over the Bronx, he picked up, more votes than he did in 2016. He didn't win. In Queens he did, in Brooklyn he did, South Texas, which was a big surprise because Hillary Clinton did a lot better there in 2016. So I think this is a big question and way forward for Democrats.
Well, just very quickly, Jerry Cadava at Northwestern, he has this new book about sort of right voting among Latinx people in the US. And last night on CNN, Mia Love, the former Republican representative from Utah, who's Black, she's Haitian, she, was sort of invoking, she is going to remain a conservative because, her Haitian parents who believe in self-responsibility and fiscal responsibility. So I think that we can also think about ethnicity and class. Yeah, absolutely. Ruth, did you want to weigh on that before I move to the next question?
The only thing I'd say is the history of, in terms of women, if you are in a situation with a white nationalist, overtly racist leader who creates a community that elevates that, if you're a white woman, you feel you have status over non-white men. And that was true, in Nazism. You kind of create these communities of the included. So that's part of it. I also saw some early post-election studies that showed, and I haven't followed this up, that among Latinx, many of those who voted for Trump identified as white.
Yes.
So there's that. And the third thing I'd say is the point about the fear of socialist, the milking of the propaganda about Biden meaning socialist apocalypse. It does resonate with people who feel wounded from Castro, or they hate Castro, or they hate Chavez. I get a lot of irate emails from people they pick up my book and they're angry that I don't have left wing. I have Gaddafi, but most of them are right wing. So this was operative as well. The Trump campaign weaponized these fears of people's memories of their parents or their own being victimized by the left to say that Biden would bring the same thing. And this worked very well for Latino people.
Well, just very quickly, I'm so glad that you brought up that example because, after the election, people kept talking about the supposed shift of Latinx voters to Trump. And this one commentator noted that if you focus on Florida, where they were able to, invoke Castro, that's true. But if you look at Arizona and you look at Latinx people there who help sort of, shift things around, a lot of them are Mexican American. It's a different dynamic.
Absolutely. That's a good point.
So we've got another question. I think we've got time for this, that whether or not there's a possibility for Democrats to put in place long-lasting discourses that would counter GOP propaganda. And also along these lines, how do you defeat charismatic, quote, bad men? Or can you?
Okay, Ruth.
Do you want to answer the first part of it, the how to put long-lasting, like hedges against for Democrats, what they should?
Well, one of the things I think is the case, and I've actually learned this from my son, who was running a congressional campaign in central Pennsylvania. I mean, he felt that one of the things that Democrats, the mistake they make is they're interested in recruiting candidates and they're not interested in establishing a local presence. And it seems to me that, it's a really interesting point that recruiting candidates without, trying to, this is sort of taking a page from the right's playbook over time, that they built a grassroots presence and it was discursive as well as it was organized around policy questions. And, they went from a situation where they were out in the wilderness to one in which they were basically sort of defining the agenda. And it seems to me that this is one, of the ways in which this can happen, where people, it's pretty hard to imagine breaking through the kind of media divides that currently exist and afflict the country, because, it seems that very few people, for example, are watching the impeachment trial or care one way or another about it. And insofar as they tune in, they'll tune into the channels that they depend on. It seems to me if the Democrats are, going to have much of a ability over time to break into that it's more about on the ground work and to try to use the resources that they have to try to build up in that way.
Yeah, great. About how to defeat bad men. Big question. I'll just say some of it in my book. It's a kind of the macro discourse is we've had this, and it's not just Americans, this fetish of the great man, in the great strategist, the genius who fixes everything, who's the savior. So it's partly this fetish of patriarchy, but these, and it's very rooted. These are archetypes also. But we've definitely had this also fetish of the man who gets away with it, the rogue. And these are enshrined in Hollywood narratives and popular culture. And so what we've done is also to glamorize lawlessness. And the whole career of Donald Trump, how he played the media, he's a very New York figure, but it can be, as we see, it can be generalized. And the essence of authoritarianism is glamorizing lawlessness and legitimizing lawlessness. And it's where the virility and the corruption, that's why I put a chapter on virility in the book, because I wanted to take it seriously. It's really important, because the man who gets away with it is somebody like Putin. That's part of his macho appeal, is that he's too important to obey. He doesn't have to obey the law. And once you get into that territory, it's that's the end of it. It's very difficult for democracy. So we also, and this prepared us to not see the red flags with Trump. People were starry-eyed, or they said he was a buffoon. But I want to point out that in January 2016, which was a huge red flag, when Trump gave the speech and he said he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose any followers. So both those parts are very important. So just a few weeks after that, Jeff Sessions came and endorsed him. And these people are nothing without their enablers. The enablers, in this case, the GOP, they bring the extremist in, they bring the bad man in, and they hold him up. So that was one. But in the same days, Trump was also hosted by Jimmy Fallon on his late night show. So this Jeff Sessions and Jimmy Fallon, who neither of whom said anything or found it a problem that Trump had boasted about killing someone or shooting someone, which was him communicating in the tradition of Duterte in the Philippines, who they boast about being ruthless and thugs. So if you accept that, if you reward that person by giving them the nomination, you're going to get the bad man. You have indeed rewarded him for being a bad man. So I hope we learned something from this experience, but that's part of the equation.
One can only hope that we've learned something, but I wonder, because it's distracting, so few people are watching these hearings.
Well, yeah.
We've got one last question from somebody in Canada. We certainly have gerrymandering in politics, but not voter suppression, as far as I'm aware. And let's see, the question just went away from me. Hang on half a second. Here it is. I wondered about the legal possibility of non-white, poor, and other suppressed U.S. citizens to gather up and launch class action suits alleging their legal right to vote being effectively taken away from them. So do you think that that's one form of mobilization? Because there's grassroots organizations like what happened in Georgia that got out the vote. Do you think that class action suits really sort of going that route might have an impact?
I don't know. I think that's really hard to tell, but it's certainly, it's important to work in whatever way possible to expose the forms of voter suppression, the kind of consequences that they have, and to demonstrate the interest in democratic practice. So, I mean, class action suits, I mean, depending on who you can find to sort of take your case, they tend to take a long time, to go through the courts. It could be one avenue, as we certainly learned in civil rights struggles, that, the legal route can be important. But I think, the kind of mobilizations that make it difficult for people to suppress the vote. I mean, there are ways of pushing back against this. And I think, some of the things that happened, say, in Georgia are good examples, so that, people need to feel interested, safe, able to vote, not challenged. I mean, obviously, if you fear walking into a polling site and being humiliated, it's, people have a, it's not exactly an encouragement to vote. So I think we really need to take the measure, obviously, to the extent that Democrats can repair the destruction of the Voting Rights Act, would be extremely important to make sure that the resources of government officials are actually put on the ground to help people. But this is part of grassroots mobilizations, and I think they can be very effective.
Ruth, do you have anything to say along these lines?
No.
I'll just add very quickly that I really agree that, it's in so many ways, it's these grassroots organizations that are going to be critical, like Organization Move Texas, that's really trying to register voters, especially people of color, but also the young, because in Texas, in terms of voter ID laws, you can use a gun permit, but not a college ID. And then you have Asian American Pacific Islander activists in California who are trying to raise awareness about the fact that many naturalized Asian citizens, they have their surname first, their first name last. And, in terms of these voter ID matchup laws, if it's reversed, then their votes are thrown out. And they're also raising awareness about the need to have information in English and other languages as well. And, other languages so that they can work against the voter disinformation that people like Trump are peddling. So I think that it's grassroots mobilization that's really going to be critical in so many ways. But the Voting Rights Act was also, it was gutted. So there's that too.
We also should, take note of the, sort of different currents. I mean, look at Florida. On the one hand, it goes for Trump, it goes for a senator and governor who are Republican, but they vote to raise the minimum wage. They vote to, end the restrictions on exercising the franchise for felons. I think there's really a need to kind of take the measure of how groups of people sort of process, their sort of political views and find ways of capturing those who you can.
It's true. And the last thing I'll say, I mean, you brought up something in terms of the disenfranchisement of people, former felons. It has disproportionately impacted a whole range of people of color, not only African Americans and Latinx people, but also Native Americans. And so, it's just moving the needle. I'll just end by saying, I think we have a lot of work to do because we're at a very interesting moment in this country. And so I really want to thank Professors Hahn and Ben-Ghiat for such fabulous presentations. Thank you. And thank you everyone for participating. We will see what happens this weekend with impeachment, but I think we already know. But at any rate, thank you everyone. Stay healthy, stay well. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.